Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our 15th Moving the Needle seminar. My name is Nasia Quintanilla, and I will be the moderator for this online seminar today. If this is your first time attending Moving the Needle, it is initiated by GIZ Fabric as part of the Asian Dialogue series, which aims to bring together industry enthusiasts and representatives from brands, suppliers, workers, civil society, and government bodies from Asia and beyond. Today, I'm very excited to be moderating this seminar on trade impact assessments on GSP and GSP Plus, case studies from Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Now, as we all know, working in the industry, the world of textiles is undergoing a shift, especially as Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, which were once least developed, experience changes in their trade patterns. Cambodia's growth was boosted by duty-free exports under the Everything But Arms Agreement. However, due to concerns about human rights, EBA was partially withdrawn, prompting Cambodia to explore new options. Meanwhile, Bangladesh is preparing for the end of EBA, and despite never being an LDC, Pakistan gained GSP status. These cases highlight the importance of effective strategies for growth, and especially me working in Cambodia in the textile industry for 6 years, it's been a very big topic in the past couple years. So we have 3 industry speakers today that I find are very insightful and knowledgeable about this topic. And starting with some introductions, I will have Mr. Paul Baker begin with a small introduction, and then we will go on to Dr. Razak and Miss Sarah Javed. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Nasia. Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here and speaking to all the participants. My name is Paul Baker. I'm a trade economist by background, and I've worked for around 20 years in East Asia, particularly looking at trade policy and industry responses to changing global events. I'm based in Mauritius. It's a country that also started its development through the textile and garment industry and has since moved into other industries. And I've been recently engaged in the last few years looking at LDC graduation. I've done some work for the World Trade Organization on this, but also for the Cambodian government, looking at how to prepare for it. And so with GIZ sponsorship, we've been carrying out a series of trade impact studies on this particular topic. And indeed, with some of you, I'll be interacting in the future because we are going to go into greater depth as to what the industry and government responses need to be for LDC graduation. So pleasure to be here. Thank you. Over to Dr. Razak.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. My name is Mohammad Abdul Razak. I am an economist by training. I have been following the LDC graduation process and the GSP schemes of the European Union on these issues. I have written quite a few things here and there. But today I'll be speaking about Bangladesh's export prospects as the country is moving out of the LDC status and also embracing other policy changes in the European Union. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sara Javed from Pakistan. I am a master's in economics, and I work as a research associate in international trade diplomacy with Pakistan Textile Council. I've been working on Pakistan's FTA engagements with international players, to be more specific with EU, especially the GSP regime. And comparatively, I'm a young economist in terms of experience, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I find this topic will be very interesting for a lot of people, especially considering quite a lot of it is happening now, especially for Cambodia, which has been a big conversation in the industry these past couple years and now becoming bigger. So we will start with Mr. Paul to begin his presentation and to see where Cambodia is with the LDCs.
Thank you, Nasia. Right, so let's get started. I only have 10 minutes, so I'll try and stick to time. I did have my stopwatch with me. There's quite a lot to say, of course, on this particular topic, particularly as for Cambodia, this is a very significant economic sector as well. Just to say, and I think it's all very clear, and I think it's been in the news sufficiently, that Cambodia did meet the criteria necessary for LDC graduation. And so by 2024, provided it continues to meet these criteria, and there's no reason to think it won't, the country will end up graduating. What that means is that the access to different markets will change because there is a special regime available to these developed countries at the moment. Many countries have given a commitment to the WTO to try and provide greater access to LDCs. So the opportunities will change in terms of that market access. There is a transition period that some countries grant to enable the countries to prepare for the new regime. So although 2024 is the date for which Cambodia would graduate, it's only from 2027 that it will face changes with regard to the European Union. In terms of why this is significant and why do we speak about the European Union in particular, what we see here is an indication of the different market access requirements. So these are the tariff rates that are applied by different countries according to the different regimes. So in the case of the United States, for example, there is no differentiation between LDCs and other developing countries. So the conditions for the United States don't change. What we see, though, for the European Union, there is quite a big change in those conditions. We see this table has three different columns. In the first column is the conditions to access the European Union if you don't have a free trade agreement. What are the tariffs being applied in that sector? We have the conditions under the GSP and the conditions under the GSP Plus. The GSP Plus and GSP are available to developing countries, but for GSP Plus, there are additional criteria that need to be met to be able to achieve that. And Sarah will actually be talking about Pakistan's experience indeed of moving from GSP to GSP Plus. And so in the case of Cambodia, at the moment it has EBA, which is a zero tariff rated regime. So there's duty-free, quota-free access to the European Union market. And that would change. It would either go to GSP or GSP Plus after this particular transition period. And so here we have up, and I think the presentations will be made available to you, some of the criteria. And the big difference between a GSP and a GSP Plus, it will automatically move into GSP unless there are sanctions against Cambodia, for example, which there's no reason to think that will be the case. But to meet the GSP Plus criteria, there are a number of conventions that need to be met in the environmental, social, and human rights spheres. And Cambodia has met the requirements for most of these conventions, so it has to ratify them as well as implement them. And the European Union tracks and monitors the progress of countries in this particular area. So as Nazia alluded to before, there were certain concerns that were raised by the European Union in the past with regards to some of the human rights aspects that are being signed up to by Cambodia. And it would continue monitoring the particular implementation of these different conventions in the future to be able to attain a GSP Plus. So we carried out an impact evaluation to see what would be the implications of moving into these different regimes. These are global pictures for Cambodia by the year 2030, because by that time, of course, GSP would be fully enforced. So it'll be the end of the transition period. And what we see is that there is a big drop, of course, in economic welfare, because, again, the access to the market is not as favorable. So we would lose competitiveness in those markets, which means we wouldn't be able to export as much. So the export impact at the bottom left-hand side of that chart, you can see is quite significant. It would fall by around 1.25%. What happens is that the decrease to the European Union specifically of trade would be quite significant, but trade would be diverted to other markets, which have not changed their market access conditions. If we can move to GSP Plus, we see that the impact is very negligible. And so that's really the important thing to note in this particular evaluation is that that if we can actually reach the requirements as Pakistan has done and as Sri Lanka managed to meet, Philippines has met, then that would enable us to have very, very little overall economic impact. but it does demand certain requirements to be able to achieve that. And I think Razak will also give you a presentation on what those requirements are and how they're evolving. They're becoming more difficult to meet with the new proposals on the GSP. The MFN scenario is basically whereby we were not able to meet the rules of origin requirements, and we go onto an MFN basis for tariffs, and that's quite a significant impact that is effectuated as a result. What we see, what we'll come to specifically on the garment sector, is that the impact on garments, of course, is particularly significant because the tariffs are very high in that particular sector in the European Union, and there's a very strong reliance for Cambodia on that particular sector as well. Just very, very quickly, it's a complicated topic, but under rules of origin, the regimes will change, and it doesn't matter whether you go for GSP or GSP+, they are the same rules that are applied. And that's what's also very, very difficult to be able to be met by industry, because while there is only one single transformation required under the EBA, the current regime that's being applied, we would need a double transformation to take place. And the rules on accumulation are very limited, so we cannot accumulate with other countries. So we need to increase the value addition and the vertical integration of industries in Cambodia to be able to meet that requirement. And that's quite difficult, it's costly, and there is the danger that many of the current investors in the country would actually use other countries to start their operations. So here is a more specific picture in terms of the garment industry. Again, we see overall what is the tariff applied to the industry in ad valorem equivalents. And we see as soon as we move to GSP, so we've got nearly a 10% tariff that's being applied. It's not extremely different between GSP and most favored nation. And under the most favored nation, you don't have any rules of origin requirement. The rules would be met with the current processes taking place in Cambodia. So there isn't a huge advantage taking place. So the output changes under these different regimes. As mentioned before, under GSP+, there's very minimal change because there are still sometimes some tariffs on some lines that exist. But under the GSP regime, we see quite a big reduction to the European Union, but much less severe happening with the exports to the world. So as mentioned before, what we do is we export more to some of the other markets to which Cambodia is currently exporting to. And in my last slide, and I think I'm more or less in time, talking about some of the recommended strategies for transitioning. And of course, we will go deeper into this particular analysis over the next few months as we interact more with industry in Cambodia. First of all, one of the options is to try and extend the grace period available to the LDCs that are transitioning, giving more time for industry to adapt. The experience is that longer transition periods don't always work, and we saw that with the dismantling of the agreement on textiles and clothing, that many European countries had 30 years to transition to the new regime and didn't manage to make much difference. But nevertheless, that's one particular angle to change. We can also ask for the extension of rules of origin to allow bilateral accumulation, for example, with Vietnam, which is currently not allowed, so that we can use some of the FTAs that are already signed up into the region and try and accumulate and build those regional value chains with other parties. Of course, we could try and secure an FTA with the European Union, but at the moment, the European Union doesn't seem to have the appetite for an FTA with Cambodia, but it is considering negotiations again with the ASEAN group, and the ASEAN then would be able to secure the access for Cambodia. And then it's relaxing some of the rules on certain products, particularly those most significant to Cambodia. The need to attract investment, that's going to remain important, particularly for this vertical integration process. In Mauritius and Madagascar, we've seen some very, very nice examples of moving up that value chain and integrating some of the processes upstream into the operations of the garment industry, and thereby meeting the rules of origin. So it can be done, but it's costly. And of course, dealing with the investment trade facilitation measures needed is important. And then, of course, there's the other business drivers that are significant. And then finally, of course, some of the skills and using the technology available in the industry to try and add more value, to try and compensate for the increases in tariff is one of the other mechanisms to try and gain market share. So I'll be happy to take questions and answers. And Nazia, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It's actually a bit ironic. You know, you would think graduating from an LDC is something that everyone would be excited about. But what I found working for a knitwear factory for 6 years in Cambodia it was actually something that they kind of dreaded, because the EBA was a bit of an upsell for Cambodia when we were, well, I wouldn't say upsell, but similar to compared to other countries, because it was something that they relied on that a lot of other countries not took advantage of, but really appreciated, especially when they were moving away from manufacturing in China. Do you find that that's the case, or do you think it's something that's more welcomed?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we've heard from the industry players that the attraction indeed, and we're working very much on close margins, right, in this industry. And so that preferential margin is very significant. And so actually, from what we've heard from many investors, not just in this industry, but in other industries that also are platforms to export from Cambodia to the EU, there is concern by the investors and whether they are going to relocate or not. So I think you're right. On the industry side, remaining in LDC was of interest, but of course, I think for policymakers, for the country, of course, we want to increase development and reduce vulnerability, and so that's a great achievement for the policymakers, I think.
Yes, I think suppliers are sweating a little bit, but hopefully they will find a new way to keep their margins secured. So then we can move on to Bangladesh, which has a similar case, but I think is a bit more ahead than Cambodia, and we can hear from Dr. Razak. Hello, Dr. Razak.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. Perfect.
Okay, and is my camera on or?
Yes, your
oh,
screen's on.
Fine, great. Thank you so much. Turning to Bangladesh, I think this is a country, is the largest LDC, and it is also graduating. So Bangladesh will leave the group of least developed countries in 2026, basically in November 2026, more precisely. Now, Bangladesh does export a lot of ready-made garments, and it is currently the second largest exporter of ready-made garments or clothing items after China. So the question is, what's going to happen after LDC graduation? Because the changes will take place. But before that, let me tell you, the last year, Bangladesh's total exports to the world was about $55 billion. And of this $55 billion, 45% came from the European Union, which is about $25 billion. Now, if you consider the United Kingdom, which had the similar kind of, or the same EU trade policy until recently, if you add UK, then the total amount of Bangladesh's dependence on the European market would be 55%. So that is the level of dependence we're talking about. Now, of the total amount of exports from Bangladesh that go to the European Union, 92% is basically ready-made garment items. So basically, Bangladesh does clothing, and it only does clothing. Now, Bangladesh is coming to terms with the changing circumstances. There are quite a few. I'm just going to highlight the top two. One is Bangladesh is graduating, as I mentioned. So as a result, it can no longer access the everything but arms. Under the current situation, after graduation in 2026, Bangladesh will be able to access the European Union market under the same EBA terms. So we won't see any European Union policy change until November 2029 for Bangladesh. And then there's also another concern about there are other bilateral agreements taking place with the European Union, and that can also complicate Bangladesh's situation. So here is the timeline. Bangladesh will have the same EBA preferences, that is duty-free market access in the case of clothing until 2029. And that market access for garments means the MFN tariff is 11.6% on average for clothing items. Bangladesh currently pays 0, and Bangladesh will continue to do so until 2029. Now, upon graduation from the LDC status, Bangladesh can apply for GSP Plus, which is considered as the second most attractive GSP provisions under the European Union law. Basically, there are two criteria to fulfill and then to qualify for GSP Plus. One is called the vulnerability criteria. I'm not going to explain them in detail. So basically, it shows if an economy is not that diversified, then it will qualify under the vulnerable criteria, and Bangladesh does qualify. And then there is something called sustainable development criteria, and under that particular criteria, any country that is applying for GSP Plus will have to ratify and implement 32 international conventions that the European Union has pre-specified. Now, for Bangladesh, maybe ratification is not that much problem. Most of the provisions have already been ratified by the government of Bangladesh. The problem will be about implementation, whether the European Union will be satisfied with the current level of implementation. However, here's the thing. Under normal circumstances, if a country can qualify for GSP Plus, that country's clothing exports should also continue to benefit from duty-free market access. That's the case for Sri Lanka. That is the case for any other countries that is trying to apply for GSP Plus. Bangladesh is going to be kind of an exception. And this is one point that we must take into consideration. Even if Bangladesh is going to end up with GSP Plus, even if Bangladesh is going to get GSP Plus benefit, Bangladesh's textiles and clothing sector will not get any benefit from the European Union GSP Plus policy. Why? Because under the GSP Plus policy, there is a provision which is called the safeguard measures. If you look into the proposed EU GSP regulations that is now being debated in the EU Parliament and with the European Council as well, then you will say Article 29 in that particular provisions has mentioned that there are certain other things that a country will have to fulfill if it is going to continue with duty-free market access in clothing. Basically, Bangladesh has got huge market share in the European Union, which is more than 6%. So Bangladesh will fail the first condition. The second condition is, even if you have more than 6% market share in the European Union in clothing items, you could qualify for GSP Plus and duty-free market access. But in that case, that country's share in the total EU GSP covered imports of textile and clothing will have to be less than 37%. Bangladesh currently has got a share of 50%. That means of the total clothing items that enter into the European Union under GSP facilities, say under zero tariff, Bangladesh currently supplies about close to 50%, much higher than 37%. Bangladesh, even if qualifies for GSP Plus, it is not going to get the duty-free market access, and that stand as per the provisions of the new EU GSP proposal, as I said, which is currently being debated in the EU Parliament. Now, that new regulation was supposed to come in from the beginning of the next year, but now the European Union has extended the current GSP regime by about 4 years. So there is a bit of a bit of window of opportunity left for Bangladesh. Bangladesh can negotiate, and if the EU is going to change the rules, then perhaps there could be some changes. But until now, the way it stands, Bangladesh will not receive duty-free market access after LDC graduation in the European Union. Okay. Now, the question is, does tariff preference matter for the apparel exports of Bangladesh? And generally, that 11.6% tariff margin is a huge margin. And as you can see, what has happened because of that particular tariff margin? In the European Union, the China's share in total extra EU clothing imports, as you can see, has fallen from more than 40% in around 2010 to less than 29.5%. And the country that has benefited most from this declining China share is Bangladesh. As you can see, the big jump in Bangladeshi market share that has taken place. And this has taken place. Bangladesh has duty-free market access into the European Union. So now the question is, what is going to happen if Bangladesh doesn't get that particular tariff preference? Now here we can compare the European Union market with the market in the US. And the Paul has already mentioned that the US doesn't provide any duty-free market access to all these big players. So look at here as well. The same kind of picture we are seeing for China as well. As you can see, the Chinese share in the US market has fallen. But Bangladesh's share in the US market has been more or less, flat. On the other hand, the country that has gained so much from the falling Chinese share in the US market is basically Vietnam. So here is the question. In this market, we have duty-free market access. That is why Bangladesh has done so well. Here is one market where Bangladesh is treated at par with other countries, and Bangladesh has not been able to increase the market access. So that is the multi-billion-dollar question that we have, is what's going to happen. In addition to that, we are seeing some other important changes. European Union is also having bilateral trade agreements with other countries. And very recently, it has got a bilateral trade deal with Vietnam. And as a result of that, the tariffs on Vietnamese clothing exports are being reduced gradually. On the other hand, the tariffs on Bangladesh's textile and clothing will increase from 2020. As you can see in the simulation, this is how the Vietnam's tariff is falling, the red line. And you see, after 2029, the tariffs on Bangladesh will go up by around 12%. So that's the question. Can Bangladesh then compete? Because it will see tariff rise because of illicit graduation. On the other hand, an important competitor like Vietnam will start getting a zero tariff. Vietnam not alone, is also negotiating FTA with Indonesia and India. And if those materialize, probably Bangladesh's situation could be quite different. Now, that is why a WTO study, it has analyzed with quantitative modeling the context, the consequences, and it has predicted that maybe Bangladesh could lose up to 14% of its exports because of illicit graduation. However, I think the situation cannot be straightforward. There are other factors that we need to take into consideration. Number one, I think if after illicit graduation, Bangladesh is not getting duty-free market access, then the prices will go up because Bangladesh is the second largest exporter to the European Union. And that price rise can give some extra room for competitiveness, and Bangladesh can take advantage of that. That's number one. Number two, there are no other countries apart from Vietnam perhaps will be able to supply in bulk quantities like Bangladesh. So that can also be a kind of competitive advantage situation for Bangladesh. And the final point that I would like to mention is that, as you have seen, the Chinese share has declined, and perhaps this is continue to decline. So that means China will leave some market space, and in that market space means the market will go up, and perhaps Bangladesh should be able to also be benefit from that market space. So that basically the Bangladesh situation. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Razak. Do you find that there's any way that Bangladesh can start to kind of protect itself from falling on the chart? Or do you think it just has to wait until 2029 and we have some more negotiations?
I think there are several options. One is, as I said, initially the European Union GSP was coming in place from the beginning of next year. Now that is not going to happen, and apparently there is going to be 3 to 4 years time. And as I said, that is a window of opportunity. A lot of negotiations, discussions going on with the European Union. So, so something can come out of that. But also taking into consideration of the geopolitical tension that we're currently seeing, a lot of countries is emphasizing on China plus one strategy. They don't want to be overwhelmingly dependent on the supplies from the China, and European Union perhaps will also take into consideration that if Bangladesh is going to get duties on its clothing export, probably China will benefit more. And this is something perhaps they might not like it. The other consideration is, as I said, Bangladesh is a very large supplier. So if Bangladesh is being imposed tariff on its exports, then the European consumers, they might also lose out. And then there is also the issue of vulnerability within Bangladesh. 3.45 million Bangladeshis, they work in this apparel industry. So the impact of the EU GSP policy is huge. And also, if you would exclude Bangladesh from the GSP scheme, then essentially the whole utility of the European Union GSP regime will come into questions. It might not have much relevance at all. So all these issues, I'm sure the EU policymakers are taking into consideration, and that might have some implications on the policy side. But on the other side, the Bangladeshi entrepreneurs, they are also trying to be competitive. They are moving into the man-made fiber. Bangladesh has now got the world's many green factories, and branding is very good. Quality terms as well, Bangladesh has gone up, and Bangladesh charges the lowest price amongst the competitors. So there are other, farm level advantage as well. So jury is still out, and I tend to think that depending on the situation, probably it's very difficult for us to draw any straightforward conclusion like what we have seen in the WTO report that Bangladesh is going to face big consequences or adverse consequences. Thank you.
Well, that's definitely the case. I mean, Bangladesh has really boomed in the past couple of years and taken advantage of this, but at the same time, they have been very proactive in sustainability and growth and learning as the industry changes versus maybe some other countries who are probably a little bit slower in especially sustainability. So it is something that I would say Bangladesh has stayed very competitive. So hopefully there isn't too many changes. And now I would like to hear about Pakistan, who is a bit of a different case in this because they were never really considered an LDC. So we will hear from Sarah.
Well, thank you so much, Nasia, and thank you, Mr. Paul. Thank you, Mr. Razak. I think my fellow panelists have done an amazing job, and they have already explained the impact of LDC graduation of Cambodia and Bangladesh on overall export performance, and of course, how it shall impact the textile and garment industry. So I will just quickly go through Pakistan's GSP Plus experience while keeping an eye on the time constraint. Sorry, I think it's, yes. So Pakistan received its GSP Plus status on 1st of January 2014, and it's still a beneficiary. As of 2022, the European Union's total imports from Pakistan stand at 9.5 billion euros. And Pakistan's shares in European Union's total imports is 0.3%. As GSP regime is disaggregated into standard GSP, then everything but arms and GSP Plus, these non-reciprocal programs are slightly different in nature, such that when we talk about the GSP Plus, so the beneficiaries, they enjoy zero duties on 2/3 of the tariff lines being exported to the EU. For that, the beneficiary must also ratify and effectively comply with the 27 UN conventions, which fall under the human rights, labor rights, climate change, and good governance. And the beneficiary countries' GSP covered imports by the European Union relative to the GSP covered imports by all the other countries must be lower than 7.5%. So these are few eligibility criteria. Since 2012, Pakistan's exports to the European Union have increased from 3.2 billion euros to 9.5 billion euros, and Pakistan received the GSP status in 2014. And since then, the exports to the European Union have increased by more than 100%. When we talk about textile sector in Pakistan, so Pakistan's textile sector represents 60% of the total exports, and it is the largest manufacturer in terms of volume and by value. In 2023, Pakistan's total exports stood at $27.7 billion US, out of which the textile exports accounted for $16.7 billion US, and the total exports to the European Union were approximately $9.5 billion US, while total textile exports to the European Union were approximately $7.5 billion. Well, owing to the macroeconomic crisis, primarily due to the fiscal mismanagement, the import ban, the control on the letter of credits, and the global energy crisis, and of course, the drop in the global demand for textiles, Pakistan exports of textiles have experienced a downfall by 14% as compared with last fiscal year. However, the month-on-month trend shows improvement. I will now discuss briefly Pakistan's performance and comparative experience under the GSP regime. This graph shows the GSP utilization per beneficiary, where the utilization is the used GSP out of the eligible GSP, which is available. So as of 2023, there were 10 beneficiaries for the standard GSP, 8 beneficiaries for GSP Plus, including Pakistan, and 47 beneficiaries for EBA status, including Cambodia and, of course, Bangladesh. So textile sector has been the largest recipient of GSP, eligible GSP among the standard GSP, the GSP Plus, and everything but ARM beneficiaries. Pakistan in 2022 received a GSP for the textile worth $6.9 billion, which is 83% of the total eligible GSP. For Bangladesh, as an everything but ARM beneficiary, the given GSP for textile was 94% of the total preferences, 70% for Cambodia, however, 28% for India, which is standard GSP beneficiary. This graph on the screen gives a glance on a comparative analysis of Pakistan's total textile exports against the textile exports to the European Union and the GSP eligible textile exports. So in 2022, we see that Pakistan has exported textiles worth $19.3 billion, out of which Pakistan exported textiles to the European Union worth $8 billion, $6.9 billion out of which were GSP eligible, and $6.4 billion were utilized. We see that the utilization of the GSP eligible for textiles has been very high. The numbers are approximations from various sources. I think my panelists from Cambodia and Bangladesh can better confirm the numbers. So out of the total textile import from Pakistan, the maximum imports are dutiable. So this screen shows a disaggregation of the European Union's total textile import from Pakistan in 2022. We see that from $7.39 billion, $7.36 billion is actually dutiable, which means that if there is no GSP plus, so the $7.36 billion is actually subject to an MFN tariff of 12%. And the GSP utilization rate for the textile GSP eligible has been very high, approximately 94%. So an immediate impact on exports of countries who are transitioning from everything but arms to either GSP or GSP Plus is based on their tariff regimes, cumulation, and graduation. So we see that since all the beneficiaries of the GSP regime, they effectively comply with the 27 UN conventions, for a beneficiary to avail GSP Plus, there has to be ratification and effective implementation of the 27 UN conventions. Also, the tariff and duty structure, they differ per regime. Zero duties on all tariff lines except arms for everything but arms. And then there's partial removal of tariffs on sensitive products, total removal of tariffs on non-sensitive products for GSP. And then there's zero duties on more than 2/3 of the total tariff lines exported to the EU. I'm not going to repeat it. My fellow panelist from Cambodia has already explained how the transition is going to happen. So as part of the European Union's Green Deal, European Union has a vision for textiles by 2030, which primarily focuses upon recyclable, repairable, competitive, resilient, sustainable, and circular textiles. So keeping that in view, Pakistan's textile sector aligns with interests of its market and focuses on sustainability and compliances. For instance, the ESG compliance, which deals with 3 pillars, including the environment, social, and governance. Pakistan's textile sector has been actively engaging in the fulfillment of the social and environmental responsibilities. The industry has been aligning itself with the UN SDGs. Then With that, the textile sector has committed to net zero carbon by 2050, which establishes a roadmap and framework through which Pakistan's private sector can accelerate its sustainability transition. Among the 26 signatories for the Net Zero Coalition, 25 companies are the textile companies. Then we have the waste recycling. Pakistan's textile sector has been focusing on recycling and reduction of waste. This is done by selling the cotton, for instance, selling the cotton waste produced during spinning to be used in the production of yarn. And there is a growing international concern in human rights violence in global value chains. Therefore, Pakistan Textile Council, in collaboration with UNDP, has designed a human rights due diligence code of conduct, namely HRDD, which shall be a guide for Pakistani textile companies to fulfill and respect human rights across the value chain. Lastly, since compliance has become mandatory for both the government and the business sector to have a presence in the international market, PTC, Pakistan Textile Council, launched an NCC, that is National Compliance Center, in collaboration with the Ministry of Commerce, Pakistan, which will address the increasingly complex compliance procedures and demands through one-step solution. That's all from my side. Thank you so much, Nasia. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. It seems that Pakistan has really taken advantage of their GSP plus status. Would you say this scheme is benefiting and will benefit in the long term too, as it continues on?
Of course, and why not? As you've seen that Pakistan's textile sector, that represents it's the largest manufacturer, represents 60% of total textile. At the same time, it's the largest beneficiary of GSP. So continuity of the GSP plus scheme is extremely important for the Pakistan's textile sector to actually sustain its presence in international markets and also expand them.
Interesting. Well, that's interesting. It's interesting how all three countries have or are on different experiences of the agreements and these trade schemes, and how they're taking advantage and kind of getting used to all of it and seeing their struggles and their achievements through it. Now, I do have an open question for the audience that I will post in the chat, but I would also like the speakers to kind of keep in mind my open question here is, considering the evolving trade dynamics discussed recently, how can international collaboration and partnerships be fostered to support countries in their transition to new trade arrangements and ensure sustainable economic growth? So we can have that for the chat, and we can also discuss it a little bit while some people are commenting. If we'd like to start with Paul.
It's a big question. Happy to try and take it. I think, one of the things, actually, we're doing a separate study right now looking at how Cambodia could leverage some of the growth as well as the free trade agreement that Vietnam has with the European Union. So how Cambodia could become a supplier to Vietnam. Now, we have this problem that if Vietnam wants to take advantage of the tariffs under the free trade agreement, it cannot accumulate with Cambodia. So that becomes an issue. But what we're trying to explore is using input-output analysis to see what would be the sectors that will grow in Vietnam and where there will be deficits in the future. So more collaboration and regional value chains being developed between the two countries. And then, as I mentioned in the chat, I think another area is that we can try and sort of bend the rules temporarily and ask if we could get a derogation. It's been done in the past with some ASEAN countries to get a derogation to allow Vietnam to source some of its materials from Cambodia. This is kind of a very short-term, medium-term strategy just to keep things going. I don't think it's a long-term strategy. We inevitably have to move up that value chain. And so how do we do that? It does normally mean attracting investment. So investment facilitation, we've just had a recent agreement at the WTO to try and improve the environment and the predictability around legislation and the investment environment in different countries. We also see at the WTO, there's a domestic regulations group looking at improving that transparency process and predictability. That will also drive investment. Cambodia itself has a lot of different policies looking at Industry 4.0, looking at digital trade and digital businesses as well as e-commerce. And so here are also avenues, I think, for implementing to make a difference. Of course, the other option is to try and find a middle ground. At the WTO, for example, we got these special concessions for least developed countries. And so we might argue that we need special concessions for countries in transition. The difficulty with getting that is that the other developing countries don't want to be at a disadvantage with those in transition. And so they would perhaps block it, such a move. So we have to understand the political economy of what's going on when we're trying to negotiate these types of agreements. Just lastly, very recently in a G20 declaration, we're also seeing a lot of measures that are trying to improve the coordination and collaboration between countries, particularly around supply chain predictability, traceability, and increasing a value addition amongst all the players. And so I think there, again, there are some opportunities. It's a very high level declaration. There's nothing concrete in it. But we can see that there are countries that are trying to move in the right direction to try and make that happen.
Do you think in regards to the human rights concerns, they will be a bit of a hindrance for these kind of concessions for Cambodia?
Yes, so it's, there are different perspectives on this. There are countries with perhaps a no better record, at least, that have better relationships with the European Union. So I think it depends very much, maybe the mood and sentiment of the European Parliament. I think it depends on the lobbying efforts as well of the country. Some countries are better at lobbying than others. It depends on the EU interests as well in this. My view is that if we're moving towards an ASEAN agreement, a lot of these domestic issues would disappear. As the whole ASEAN markets becomes very significant, the power plays change as well, right? So the European Union has a very strong vested interest in having successful outcomes for all parties so that it can also benefit from that very, very large market of ASEAN. So for me, again, power in numbers, that will make a difference if we can try and get an ASEAN agreement. And so that Cambodia should really push its ASEAN partners who may have less interest in reaching an agreement with the EU. They need to try and work together to try and make sure that that happens. So the LDCs or the LDCs in transition should really work with ASEAN to get benefits. The problem we have is that some LDCs don't have an interest because they're not graduating yet. And therefore, they won't benefit from the predictability of an FTA. They have that already. So that's an issue.
Sorry, Paul, I'm giving you all of the loaded questions. Dr. Razak, how do you feel about international collaboration and partnerships to be fostered to support countries going through these transitions, especially Bangladesh?
I think there are quite a few opportunities here. I believe one issue is what a country can do at the national level. And there can be, the countries need support either for industrial upgradation, to improve maybe in some cases the working condition, which is somehow, is linked to the EU GSP mechanism. But I would also like to consider some broader aspects. And for me, that room has opened a little bit. So let's talk about the general rules and provisions of the GSP and GSP Plus. You see, since the European Union has given an extension to the current GSP regime, and this is something where I would like to point out that my colleagues, they have mentioned about 27 international conventions. But if you look at the proposed GSP regime that the European Union, as I said, is in the European Union Parliament and with the Council, there that number has increased to 32. But even then, that regime was supposed to be come in place from the beginning of next year. Now that has been deferred. So we have 3-4 years. And my hunch is the European Union is also considering other options, like, certainly I can give you this, issue of double transformation. And this is one area where international collaboration can take place. Consider this fact. If you are having trade based on global value chain, then it is so difficult to add 40% value addition or 50% value addition, which the EU GSP Plus would require in the case of non-garment items. And in the case of garment items, it would ask for double transformation. And double transformation is a huge task. Even a country like Bangladesh, it won't be able to fulfill double transformation in the case of woven garments. In the case of knitwear, garments, Bangladesh has that capacity. So my hunch is this: if the graduating LDCs, they are negotiating in a coordinated manner, there could be that relaxation as well, and we have that window of opportunity for us, as I mentioned earlier. And especially the fact is, if you are going to block the supplies from Bangladesh and Cambodia, probably you're going to rely more on China. And this is something certainly the European Union wouldn't like at this point. So that's the first thing. My other view is, if we are going to the WTO, probably that is a sheer waste of time. Because we know, given the current geopolitical tensions, WTO members are not in a position to take any decision, that will be meaningfully, I would say, the developing countries will find it helpful. We have seen the divisions, and WTO is basically the multilateralism is faltering, you see. And the only significant reforms will have to be undertaken before we are going to say any significant consensus to be reached by the developing countries. So we are quite far from that. And that is why I think it is with the European Union, how well we are going to place our cases. And European Union itself is thinking, its policymakers are also quite concerned about the current global context. So I think, there can be some good news for Bangladesh and Cambodia as well, who are graduating out of the LDCs. And of course, in other collaboration, if you would like to help these countries on the sustainability issues, the circulation economy and things like that, I think some support mechanism is there. But in the future, I believe, there is also a fundamental room for collaboration, and that discussion is also taking place, especially under the Sustainable Development Goals pillar, but also elsewhere bilaterally and multilaterally as well. Yeah, thank you.
So good to know that, for the most part, it does feel a bit supported. And I guess because everyone has, a vested interest too on seeing growth and not decline. So it does sound positive. Sarah, would you say the same for Pakistan?
Well, Nasia, are you repeating the same question on international partnerships?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I totally agree with what Paul has said, what Dr. Razak has said. And to mention the new GSP regime, yes, definitely it's going to include more conventions, and it's going to be even strict in terms of compliance and ratification. It shall include, I think, 32 conventions in total. So here comes the role of international partnerships, where I feel that international partnerships through, let's say, through Global Gateway, they can work on more sustainable and trusted connections between the European members and the LDCs, while focusing on the democratic values, good governance, green and clean energy, private sector investments. So complying with the convention, since it is now mandatory, there is GSP plus, or there is no GSP, or there's GSP. The compliance has become mandatory. It's not just for the European Union, it's for all the international players. So I feel that collaborating through partnerships can make the countries more sustainable and comply with these international standards.
Great. Perfect. Okay. So now we will have some time to go over the Q&A from our participants in the chat. I see that there have been some answers and some back and forth already. We can go over them for the rest of the participants. I will also leave a couple minutes to have anyone feel free to ask any more questions, and to remind that we do have a feedback link. So whoever would like to leave us some feedback. That would be really great. This is my first time moderating, so it would be great to hear some feedback. Only good feedback, please. So we will leave a couple minutes for this, but we can start on some questions that I see have already been asked. I see Tom asked Paul, looking at the expected drop in overall garment exports relative to EBA baseline, minus 1% drop by my interpretation of the graph, is it correct in stating that the partial removal of EBA in 2020 was a far more impactful movement for Cambodia's garment sector than the LDC graduation? Sorry, Paul, I'm going to have you repeat. I see that you answered it, but I'll just have you repeat it quite quickly.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. No, indeed. So first of all, the projections was assuming that they reinstated EBA fully by that time, because we believe that there's a chance that will occur. So the baseline assumed that was the case, right? So we're looking at the change from the baseline, and perhaps that question is, well, if it's already had the impact because we already had partial removal, how would you get an additional major impact? So no, it's assuming that things went back to normal and then the country graduates, and so that's the difference between the two. And he did have another question, which was with regard to the how do we come up with these numbers? We don't come up with them completely from thin air, but there is a lot of criticism about the models that are used, but it's the best model that's available. So we use a global trade model to try and see what is the impact from differences in prices that arise from changes in tariff schedules. With regard to the rules of origin, whether they could be met or not, we just assumed if they could not be met, then that meant that only GSP, some GSP values would turn to MFN. And so that was the modeling that we did. So it's more of a binary change that occurred from it.
Okay, interesting. So now, like, the model that we're using, it's based off of the model that they've used for previous countries that were LDC graduating, correct?
So it's not just for graduations. This is the model that's used by the World Bank, it's called GTAP. It's a GTAP model. And so it's a global model with all different countries, and you can look at the country effects, specific country effects arising from changes in trade policies or a WTO negotiation or free trade agreements. So you can input into the model many different parameter changes, and then you can get these types of results. And you look at the welfare impacts, the trade impacts, the GDP impacts, the employment impacts. So we've done all of that analysis to look at overall how would it impact on Cambodia.
Interesting. Okay. I see Tom wrote, I summarized as it's complicated for now, and I will summarize it as that too. That's interesting. Okay. So now we have one question for Sarah. Have you developed any GSP plus reporting mechanism for industries?
Yes, thank you so much. Nasia, I've answered that question in the in the window, chat window as well. So reporting mechanisms, currently Pakistan Textile Council is working on potential collaborations, and it's working on its members reporting under one window, specifically the compliance related to the GSP plus. Soon it's going to it's going to take the shape of a tangible product, and it's going to be available for the public as well.
Okay. Perfect. Now we also have, sorry, I'm reading these at the same time as I'm getting the answers, so my brain is flooding. But I have a general question, I guess, for the whole team here. I'm curious if this group has knowledge on potential teaming up of countries based on capabilities. For example, cotton is grown in Pakistan and Bangladesh, is more mature in stitching, and does not grow as much. Could such partnerships support double transformation? Maybe we can hear from Dr. Razak.
Yes, I think, first of all, I think the one thing we should remember, the rules of origin provisions are different for garment, than other products. So in the case of other products, the European Union has specified the value of the product that will have to be produced domestically. So normally when a country is least developed countries, then if you are producing a non-garment product, then 30% of the value added will have to be produced domestically within that particular LDC before that LDC can take advantage of duty-free market access. So in the case of bicycle, if a bicycle is priced at say $100 in the global market, and if Bangladesh is exporting a bicycle or Cambodia is exporting a bicycle to the European Union, then Cambodia will have to make sure that 25% of the materials value added is being produced domestically, and it could also be the labor, like their value that is also considered as part of the value addition process. When it comes to the garment sector, it is defined in terms of transformation. So if a country is producing, say, woven garments, then that country will require double transformation, means it can import cotton, but from cotton, that country will have to transform it into yarn, and from that yarn to fabric. So that two-stage value addition will have to take place within that particular country. So essentially that would imply, if we would like to be benefited from EU GSP Plus after LDC graduation, the country will have to have fabric producing capacity within their domestic economy. So that's one thing. Now, it's very challenging, you see, because most countries, especially LDCs, they do not have that kind of backward linkage capacity. But there are certain exceptions that have also been provided, which we call regional cumulation. So under the regional cumulation rules, it is possible, for example, Bangladesh, if it is graduating and if it wants to take advantage of regional cumulation, under certain context, it can procure things within its regional cumulation partners that have been allowed. So maybe in the context of Bangladesh, it could be India or Pakistan. In the context of Cambodia, it could be other ASEAN countries. Just to give you an example, for example, the UK has recently allowed that any LDC, they can go for cumulation with 95 countries in the world. It doesn't have to produce, and if it is importing from those 95 countries, it can still take advantage of the duty-free market access in the UK. So it depends. In the case of clothing, it is very challenging because most LDCs do not have the capacity to produce fabric domestically. And for other products as well, adding 50% value added is always challenging, you see. These days, as I said, we live a system where we import from another country and we're exporting. Value addition rarely exceeds 50% unless you are supplying agricultural products. You see. In manufacturing, adding 50% value in exports is almost difficult. So that is why, I was saying that maybe the European Union is also now taking into consideration that LDCs that do not have capacity to add that much value, so they might consider some kind of derogation. Thank you.
I mean, I guess there's no one country that I know based off my experience in the textile industry that really can go through the supply chain from start to finish 100% and produce cotton, for example, and then up until shipping out. I mean, they all kind of work together to a certain capacity with their own rules and regulations. So for example, I know Cambodia, we imported a lot of yarn from China just due to proximity. Bangladesh, I imagine similar with India and cotton. And so it is interesting to see how they can support each other to only a certain extent, really. Now, let's see here. We have a question for Paul. What should Cambodia focus mainly now to prepare to get more advantages from current GSP status and transition from LDC?
Well, I just mentioned that, you don't really want to get just GSP status because in the sectors that matter to Cambodia, the tariff advantages are minimal. So you want to get to GSP plus, so that's what you need to invest in. You need to make sure you tick the boxes and get GSP plus. Again, long term, you need to add value and everything else because you can't stay constantly dependent with that particular risk of getting off GSP plus. But in the short term, medium term, you just need to make sure you get to GSP plus. And so there are changes that need to be made, and you need to ratify certain things, but then also you need to work hard in terms of diplomacy to work with the EU to get them to accept that you are eligible for that. I think that's for me the short term, medium term aim.
Dr. Razak, would you agree that GSP and GSP plus in the case for Bangladesh is a very big difference?
To be honest, for Bangladesh, it can make big difference, partly because I say that even if Bangladesh is going to get GSP plus, the proposed rules that have come from the European Union, Bangladesh's government sectors will get excluded. So all on a sudden, from 2029 November, Bangladesh will see that the average tariffs on Bangladesh's clothing will rise from currently 0% to about 12%. So that's kind of a big shock. And we need to see, whether any concessions will be given by the European Union on this. Now, I would like to mention here is that if you would consider the other sectors, that is apart from the garment sector, then the issue is in not many sectors, the preference is that big. Because you see, in the case of the ready-made garments or clothing, the MFN tariffs are really high. So that is why the level of protection or level of preferences are also quite significant. But there are many other items. In general, the average MFN tariff in the European Union is between 3 to 5%. So with that 3 to 5%, and then you have the rules of origin criteria, which is 50% domestic value added. So that means, apart from garments, probably it is so difficult, to get genuine benefit, out of the EU trade policy, because it is already quite liberal. And also in my presentation, I mentioned that the EU is also having bilateral trade agreements with many other countries. So that is also causing a bit of a preference erosion. So the answer to your question is both yes and no, depending on, in the case of Bangladesh, if the ready-made garments is going to get anything after LSE graduation. That's number one. And number two is not all products have got significant tariff margin in the European Union to be able to derive benefits from. So that is also an issue. And Bangladesh exports overwhelmingly ready-made garments. 92% of our exports to the European Union is ready-made garments. So if the ready-made garments is not getting any preferences due to market access after LSE graduation, then essentially for us, the whole significance of the EU GSP regime will perhaps come to very close to the end. Although if you're talking about the potential export, maybe given the remaining sectors that exist, maybe in the future, in the long run, over 10, 20 years, perhaps there could be some growth. But to be honest, if Bangladesh is excluded and our ready-made garment sector is excluded, then more or less all tangible benefit will be lost almost immediately.
It's interesting how these investments either can be very beneficial, in a very short amount of time, or it has to be a very long-term planning process. I mean, I guess it is with anything in this industry, though. So now I will just do a quick feedback reminder. I will leave the link in the chat to make sure if anybody would like to leave any feedback, it is there. And if anybody has any final questions for Sarah and for Paul and for Dr. Razak, please feel free to post them now, and I will be happy to go over them before our session is finished. We have a couple minutes left. I feel like I did learn a lot in this webinar. I don't have very much. I have more industry experience in regards to LDC, especially in Cambodia, since that was a conversation that many suppliers were having these past couple years, and they were sweating about it because it was something that is going to change a lot of the industry. However, I've never really had an in-depth conversation, so this has been very insightful for me as a moderator to also learn about all of the changes and also the experiences of Bangladesh and Pakistan and how different they actually are from each other. So it will be also interesting for Cambodia to see its graduation process, I find. No. I don't think we have any more questions. So we can go ahead. Please also, again, feel free to give any feedback for today's event. And I hope everyone gained some valuable insights into these dynamic trade agreements that countries like Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan have, and their journeys from least developed countries status to navigating these trade agreements in a very complex international platform. So it's a very exciting time, I think, especially for Cambodia now that the EBA is getting phased out and we're looking into GSP, and also to compare the differences that and the different experiences Pakistan and Bangladesh have had in these challenges that they have faced. And it seems for the most part overcome. I mean, it's a work in progress like anything, but it does seem like a very, for the most part, positive experience as it moves along, and hopefully it stays that way. This is kind of a case study that we present today as a reminder that it is an ever-evolving landscape, and the textile industry does take a lot of strategic planning from many in the industry, and it's good that we have these discussions that spark new ideas and we can learn from. So once again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Paul and Sarah and Dr. Azak, for your presentations. I really do appreciate it a lot, and I hope everyone has learned in this session today on these trade agreements, and we hope to see you again in future seminars.
Thank you very much, Nasia.
Thank you so much, Nasia. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Nasia.
Thank you all. Thank you for being great teachers and for being my first webinar moderating speakers. It's very
You've
exciting.
done a great job, Nasia. It was great.
Yeah.
I hope to see you guys again soon. Hopefully I'll do a lot of these. I'll become an expert in LDCs and GSP and GSP Plus. All right.
Thank you, Nasia.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good
Thank you,
night.
Razak. Thank you, Paul.